Buying cheap is one of the most expensive habits people have, and most people think they're saving money. A 10-pound kettle, a cheap pair of headphones, a 10-pound shirt instead of a 40-pound one. They look like smart decisions, but cheap doesn't always mean saving. Sometimes it means replacing, and replacing is where the real cost begins. Cheap things are attractive for one simple reason: they reduce pain in the moment. If you're standing in a shop choosing between two items, one costing 15 pounds and the other costing 60 pounds, your brain naturally prefers the 15 pounds option. You feel like you've just saved 45 pounds, but here's the problem. Most purchases don't exist in isolation, they exist over time. And time is where cheap things often become expensive. Because cheap products rarely fail immediately, they fail gradually. The stitching loosens, the plastic cracks, the battery weakens, and eventually you replace it. So what originally felt like saving money turns into repeated spending. And repeated spending quietly adds up. Imagine two people buying shoes. Person A buys a pair for 20 pounds. Person B buys a pair for 60 pounds. At first glance, person A looks smarter. They spent 4 times less. But here's what often happens. Cheap shoes tend to wear out faster. The soles flatten, the stitching loosens, the material breaks down. So after a few months, person A buys another pair, and then another, and another. Meanwhile, person B is still wearing the same pair. Now fast forward a few years, person A may have bought 5 or 6 pairs of shoes. Total cost, about 120 pounds. Person B, still wearing the same 60 pounds pair. The person trying to save money ended up spending more. This pattern appears everywhere. Cheap clothes, cheap bags, cheap accessories. They look like savings at first, but often they're simply delayed spending. Now let's talk about electronics, because this is where the cheap trap becomes even clearer. Imagine buying a cheap kettle for 10 pounds. It works perfectly for a year. Then it stops, so you replace it. Another 10 pounds. 2 years later, the same thing happens again. After 5 years, you might have bought 3 kettles. Total cost, 30 pounds. Now imagine someone else bought a 30-pound kettle from the beginning. It lasted the full 5 years. The person who thought they were saving money actually spent the same amount, sometimes even more. And this doesn't just happen with kettles. It happens with headphones, chargers, small appliances. Many of them aren't designed to last. They're designed to be replaced, which turns a cheap purchase into a repeating expense. Cheap decisions can also appear in less obvious places, like food, fast food, and ultra-cheap meals often cost less in the moment. A 2-pound snack, a 5 pounds takeaway. But when cheap convenience becomes a habit, the costs can show up elsewhere: less energy, lower quality nutrition, sometimes long-term health costs. Now this isn't about never choosing cheaper food. It's about recognizing something important. Price doesn't always represent real cost. Sometimes the true cost appears later. So what's the lesson here? It's not that cheap things are always bad. The real issue is confusing cheap with value. Cheap simply means low price today. Value means what something costs over time. The cheapest item on the shelf is not always the cheapest to own. The most financially stable people often think differently about spending. They don't just ask, how much does this cost? They ask, how long will this last? The biggest money leaks rarely come from huge mistakes. They come from small habits repeated many times, replacing the same item again and again. Buying something cheap only to buy it again later. And over years, those small decisions quietly shape your finances. Because wealth isn't just built by earning more. It's often built by spending more intentionally. Understanding what actually lasts. The cheapest option today is simply the most expensive option later. Because when it comes to money, small choices don't just disappear. They add up, quietly, over time. And that's how the smallest decisions can shape the biggest outcomes. If you've ever replaced the same cheap item again and again, you've experienced this trap. And once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. Then there's something people almost never calculate. Time. Returning faulty items, shopping again, reading reviews, waiting for replacements. Cheap things often cost more time than money, and time is the one resource you never get back. But the biggest cost is psychological. When something is cheap, you stop caring about the decision. You buy quickly, you replace quickly. You repeat the cycle. Cheap purchases feel harmless, so they happen more often. And small, harmless purchases are exactly the ones that add up the fastest. This is why cheap things can quietly keep people stuck. Not because they look expensive, but because they never look expensive enough to question. There's actually a term for this problem. It's called false economy. That's when something looks cheaper in the moment, but ends up costing more over time, and it shows up everywhere. Cheap shoes that wear out in a few months, cheap chargers that stop working, cheap furniture that barely survives one move. Every time it breaks, you go back to the store. And every time you go back, you spend again. Individually, these purchases feel small, but stacked over years, they quietly drain thousands. People who struggle financially often believe they can't afford quality, so they buy the cheapest option available. But ironically, that decision forces them to buy the same thing again and again. Meanwhile, someone who buys one durable item once moves on and never pays that cost again. It's not about spending more money, it's about spending fewer times. A useful rule is this: if you're going to use something every day, cheap is usually the most expensive choice. Shoes, mattresses, kitchen tools, office chairs. Things you use daily should last daily, because when they don't, you end up paying for them over and over again. The goal isn't to buy the most expensive option. The goal is to avoid buying the same thing 5 times. Because small, repeated purchases are exactly how money disappears without people noticing. And that's the real trap. Cheap things don't feel expensive, but over time, they add up. Most people don't become poor from one big decision. They become poor from hundreds of small ones. Cheap things, subscriptions, convenient spending, none of them feel expensive. But together, they quietly shape your financial life. This is It Adds Up. One cost every week. Follow if you care where your money goes.